Hi, I'm Pastor Becca, and I'm back with a time for the child in all of us. Today, I want to talk about everybody's favorite topic, change. Now, change is happening all the time, all around us, within us, in the world, with God. Change is big and is constant, but it's not necessarily good or bad. It just is. And change happens for lots of reasons, but I want to think about change that happens because of the circumstances, the things that happen in our lives. Now, sometimes when we talk about things happening in our lives, especially hard things, we describe them by saying we got into hot water. That means a hard situation or a difficult thing in our lives. I got into hot water. Well, hot water is something that can change things, that can change us, the circumstances of our lives, and literally, hot water changes things. But different people react differently and are impacted differently by the circumstances in our lives, by the hot water we get into. Imagine for a moment that we have some noodles, dry noodles. Now, dry noodles are hard, they're tough. They're also a little brittle. You can't bend them. If you do, they'll break into pieces. But if you take those same noodles and you put them into hot water and you let them sit there for a little while in the boiling water, the noodles change. They are transformed. Something happens and they become softer. Soft enough that you can pick them up and they'll bend over a fork. Soft enough that they're good to eat. Soft enough that you can bend them and they won't break. This is a change that happens because the noodles were in some hot water. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing. Sometimes being made softer means we might feel weaker or less resilient. We might feel like we have less energy, like a wet noodle. But sometimes being softer means that our hearts are softer and more tender. We're open to other people and their feelings. So it's not necessarily bad to be softer either. But let's imagine instead of noodles, I took an egg. A raw egg, as we know, if we broke the shell of a raw egg, it would go everywhere. But if I put that egg into hot water, and I let the egg sit there in the boiling water for a few minutes, the egg will change. That hot water, those circumstances will change the egg and make it harder, just as it made the noodles softer. The egg changes and becomes harder, which means even when we break the shell, it holds together better. It's tougher, stronger, safer to eat, more tasty. But sometimes, just like with the change in the noodles, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. Sometimes being harder, changing because of the circumstances of in our lives and feeling like we are harder might mean we feel bitter or angry, like our hearts are hardened and we don't want to let other people or other feelings in. Or it might mean that we're stronger and we hold together better. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's just change that happens because of the hot water that the egg was in. Or imagine that I use some tea, some dried herbs and spices, leaves of plants, held together loosely in a tea bag or a tea ball, and we put the tea in the hot water. Now, the tea might change a little. It might become a little less strong in its intensity and its flavor. But what happens is the tea gives of itself some of its smells and its flavors. It gives of itself to the hot water. And it's not really the tea that changes, or not much, but the hot water changes. Sometimes when we get ourselves into a circumstance or we're placed into a circumstance, we get into some hot water. It's not us that changes, or not only us that changes, but we can change the circumstance around us. We can change the hot water. And the hot water becomes itself tea, something that we can drink and enjoy, maybe alongside a hard-boiled or soft-boiled egg. Change is happening all the time in our lives and in the world. And the Bible tells us that when we are changing, when we are becoming more impacted by the world around us, we're not to change to be more like the world, but to be transformed to be more like God, or like God's image for us. And we hope that we are part of the change, the transformation that God is working in all of the world too, just like the dry tea leaves become part of the change that's happening in the water itself. So when we get into hot water, when the world around us feels difficult, or like there's just a lot of change, we may respond in different ways, different people, different moments in our lives. We can become harder or softer, and we can become part of the change that's happening all around and in us. We can be stronger and more resilient because of what we've been through, stick together better, and maybe help one another better. We can become hardened and bitter and angry and try to close people out. We can become weaker and have less energy, or softer and gentler with open, softened hearts and tenderness toward one another. And maybe we can become part of the change itself, part of what gives the world more joy or more flavor, more uniqueness, more and more of the image that God is trying to pour out into the world. We don't want to avoid change, and that's a good thing because we can't. But what we do want is to control the things we can change about ourselves, so that when we are being made softer, it is to be more tender. When we are being made harder and changed to be tougher, we are made more resilient and stick together better. And when we are able, we give of ourselves to be part of the change in the world, so that the world and we can be more like God envisions. I pray that you might be part of the change the world needs.